They told him he didn't belong, but they had no idea he was the boss. What happened next? It's the kind of revenge you'll never forget. Imagine boarding your own private plane, only to be insulted and humiliated by someone you hired. That's exactly what happened to a black man when a white pilot assumed he didn't belong. The pilot's racist comments shocked everyone on board, but the real twist? This wasn't just any passenger. What happened after he revealed his true identity left the entire crew speechless and the pilot regretting every word. This story isn't just about revenge, it's a wake-up call for anyone who underestimates the power of humility and respect. Stay tuned, because this one will blow your mind. A black man walks into the private lounge of a luxury airline, exuding confidence yet keeping a low profile. He's dressed in a simple but classy outfit, no flashy logos, no ostentatious displays of wealth. He makes his way to the check-in counter, handing over his boarding pass with a polite smile. But instead of being greeted warmly, he's met with suspicious glances from the receptionist. She hesitates for a moment before scanning his pass, her demeanor cold and distant. A subtle but unmistakable tension fills the air as other passengers in the lounge exchange whispered comments and judgmental looks. Soon, the boarding call is made, and the man approaches the gate. The whispers grow louder. Some passengers shake their heads, clearly assuming he doesn't belong there. He ignores the stares, keeping his focus forward. But the real confrontation begins when he steps onto the plane. Standing at the entrance is the pilot, a middle-aged white man with an air of arrogance. His gaze narrows as he spots the passenger. With a condescending smirk, he steps forward and blocks the aisle. "Excuse me," the pilot says, his voice dripping with disdain. "Are you sure you're on the right flight?" The black man calmly nods. "Yes, this is my flight," he replies, his tone even and composed. The pilot scoffs, glancing at the man's ticket. "We don't usually allow passengers to sit in this area unless they belong here. This is a private charter, not economy." The insult is as clear as day. The pilot's words aren't just a challenge to his boarding pass, they're an attack on his identity, an assumption that his skin color automatically disqualifies him from occupying such a space. Other passengers, already seated, begin craning their necks to watch the scene unfold. Some look embarrassed, while others wear expressions of curiosity, as if waiting for the pilot to put this man in his place. But the black man doesn't flinch. He takes a deep breath and says firmly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I have every right to be here." The pilot's smirk fades slightly, but he doesn't back down. "Look, I don't want to cause a scene, but maybe you should double-check your booking. People often mix up flights, especially ones like these." Now it's the passengers who begin to stir, their murmurs filling the cabin. The tension is palpable. The black man glances around and notices the uncomfortable silence from the crew, who seem unwilling to intervene. "Sir," the man says calmly, "I've already checked my booking. This is my plane, and I intend to take my seat." The pilot's face hardens. His pride is on the line now, and he's not about to lose this battle. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave until we can verify your information. We don't tolerate trespassing on private charters." At this point, the murmurs grow louder. The pilot's tone has shifted from condescension to outright hostility. The black man remains calm, though a flicker of frustration crosses his face. He stands firm, refusing to move, while the pilot continues his tirade. One passenger, sitting in the first row, leans over to her companion and whispers, "Why doesn't he just leave? It's obvious he doesn't belong here." Another nods in agreement, their expressions filled with judgment and ignorance. The black man doesn't let the comments faze him. Instead, he meets the pilot's gaze and asks, Is this how you treat all your passengers? Or just the ones who look like me? The question hangs in the air like a challenge, silencing the murmurs for a brief moment. The pilot, caught off guard, struggles to respond. His arrogance falters, but only for a second. He straightens his posture and snaps, "I'm doing my job. If you can't prove you're supposed to be here, I'll have to call security." The threat is loud and clear, but the black man doesn't back down. His calm demeanor only seems to irritate the pilot further. The crew continues to watch in silence, unwilling to confront their superior, while the passengers exchange uncomfortable glances. By now, it's clear to everyone that this confrontation isn't about a ticket or a seat, it's about prejudice. The black man's very presence challenges the pilot's assumptions, exposing the deep-seated biases that still linger in spaces like these. But the black man knows something the pilot doesn't. This isn't just a passenger versus pilot standoff. There's a much bigger twist waiting in the wings, and it's about to change everything. The cabin was silent, except for the whispers and murmurs of the passengers, each one captivated by the tension in the air. The black man, still calm and composed, looked the pilot directly in the eyes. There was a moment of stillness before he replied. "Call security, then," he said with a faint smile. "Let's clear up this misunderstanding once and for all." The pilot, visibly flustered, hesitated. His authority had been challenged, and he wasn't used to being questioned, especially by someone he considered beneath him. The crew exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. They had seen the pilot's temper before, but this was different. This was unfolding in front of a full cabin, and everyone was watching. The pilot finally turned to one of the flight attendants. "Get security on the line," he barked, his voice laced with irritation. The black man, unfazed, calmly took out his phone. As he dialed the number, the passengers leaned in, curious to see what he would do. Within moments, he was speaking to someone on the other end. "Yes, it's me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm on my plane, and there seems to be some confusion. Could you please have someone address this immediately?" The passengers exchanged confused glances. His plane? They thought. The words hung in the air, but no one dared to voice their curiosity just yet. Meanwhile, the pilot was pacing near the cockpit, his confidence starting to waver. He had expected this man to back down, to leave quietly and avoid further humiliation. But instead, the situation was escalating, and the man's calm demeanor was unnerving. A few minutes later, the man put his phone away. "I suggest we wait a moment," he said, addressing the pilot. "Things are about to get very clear." The pilot scoffed. "Listen, I don't care who you called. If you don't have proof that you're supposed to be here, you're not flying on this plane." At that moment, a crew member approached the pilot hesitantly. "Sir," she said in a low voice, "we just received a call from corporate." They said the passenger. "Well, he's the owner." The pilot froze. The words hit him like a thunderclap. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The owner," she repeated, glancing nervously at the black man, who stood there watching the exchange. "This is Mr. Johnson, the CEO of the airline." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. Passengers who had been whispering among themselves now sat in stunned silence. The pilot's face turned pale as the realization sank in. This wasn't just any passenger. This was the man who signed his paycheck, the person at the very top of the company he worked for. The black man, now revealed as the CEO, looked around the cabin, his eyes meeting those of the passengers who had judged him earlier. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others stared back, their expressions a mixture of shock and guilt. "Now," the CEO said, turning back to the pilot, "shall we talk about professionalism?" about how employees of this airline are expected to treat every passenger, regardless of how they look or where they come from. The pilot stammered, trying to find the right words. I didn't realize. I thought, he began, but the CEO held up a hand to stop him. No, he said firmly. You didn't think. You assumed. And your assumptions led you to humiliate me in front of a plane full of people. Tell me, is this how you treat all our customers, or am I just a special case? The pilot's face turned red with shame. He opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. The silence in the cabin was deafening. The CEO continued, his tone calm but authoritative. As the owner of this airline, I've worked hard to ensure that our staff uphold the highest standards of respect and professionalism. Today, you've shown me that we still have work to do, and it starts with holding people accountable. The passengers watched in awe as the CEO addressed the situation with grace and dignity. Some nodded in approval, while others looked visibly uncomfortable, likely reflecting on their own prejudices. The CEO then turned to the flight attendants. I want to thank you all for your professionalism during this situation, he said. You handled yourselves well, even when things got tense. Finally, he looked back at the pilot. As for you, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. We'll discuss this further once we land. For now, I suggest you focus on doing your job and doing it well. The pilot nodded silently, his confidence completely shattered. He turned and walked back to the cockpit, his head hanging low. As the CEO took his seat, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted once again. Passengers who had judged him earlier now looked at him with respect and admiration. Some even offered quiet apologies, which he acknowledged with a gracious nod. The lesson was clear. Arrogance and prejudice had no place here. And for those who doubted the man's worth based on his appearance, they had just been given a masterclass in humility and leadership. As the tension in the cabin finally began to settle, the passengers and crew were still reeling from the revelation. The black man, now fully recognized as the CEO and owner of the airline, had returned to his seat, composed but resolute. Yet, it was clear to everyone that this situation was far from over. The pilot, meanwhile, remained in the cockpit, visibly shaken. He had just learned the hard way that his assumptions and arrogance had backfired spectacularly. But what he didn't know was that his reckoning was only just beginning. Minutes into the flight, the CEO called over one of the senior flight attendants. Speaking quietly but firmly, he asked her to deliver a message to the pilot. Tell him to meet me in the cabin as soon as we land, he said. The attendant nodded and disappeared into the cockpit, her expression unreadable. The rest of the flight was eerily quiet. Passengers, still processing what they had witnessed, exchanged hushed whispers. Some tried to steal glances at the CEO, curious to see how he would handle the situation. Others sat silently, perhaps reflecting on their own biases or feeling second-hand embarrassment for the pilot. Finally, the plane touched down, and the pilot reluctantly emerged from the cockpit. His usual confidence was replaced by a hesitant, almost fearful demeanor. He avoided eye contact with the passengers as he walked down the aisle toward the CEO, who was now standing near the exit. The cabin door had been opened, and the warm breeze from the runway filtered in. Yet, the atmosphere remained tense as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The CEO didn't waste any time. Captain, he said, his tone calm but commanding, let's have a word outside. The two men stepped onto the tarmac, followed by the flight attendants and a few curious passengers who lingered near the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the unfolding drama. Standing face to face, the CEO addressed the pilot directly. Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done today? He asked. The pilot fumbled for words. I made a mistake, he stammered. I didn't realize who you were." "That's exactly the problem," the CEO replied sharply. "You shouldn't have to know someone's title or status to treat them with basic respect. Your behavior today wasn't just unprofessional, it was unacceptable." The pilot hung his head, unable to meet the CEO's piercing gaze. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "It won't happen again." But the CEO wasn't finished. "An apology is a start," he said. "But actions have consequences. Your attitude and assumptions today didn't just reflect poorly on you, they reflected poorly on this airline and everything it stands for." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "This airline was built on a foundation of respect, inclusion, and excellence. What you demonstrated today goes against all of that. So here's what's going to happen." The passengers inside the plane craned their necks, straining to hear what was being said. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was about to unfold. "I'm placing you on immediate suspension," the CEO announced. "You will undergo mandatory training on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And before you're allowed back in that cockpit, you'll have to prove that you've learned from this experience, not just for yourself, but for the sake of every passenger who entrusts their lives to this airline." The pilot's face turned pale. Suspension was a heavy blow, especially for someone with his tenure. But the CEO's voice softened slightly as he added, "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is whether you're willing to grow from them. This is your opportunity to do better. Don't waste it." With that, the CEO turned and walked back toward the plane. The passengers watching from the windows quickly turned away, pretending not to have been eavesdropping. The pilot remained on the tarmac, stunned and silent, as the weight of the moment settled over him. Back inside the cabin, the CEO addressed the passengers directly. "Thank you all for your patience during this situation," he said. "What happened today was unacceptable, and I want to assure you that steps are being taken to address it. This airline is committed to treating every passenger with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." His words were met with scattered applause from the passengers, who were visibly impressed by his handling of the situation. Some even approached him to express their support or offer quiet apologies for their earlier assumptions. As the CEO prepared to disembark, one passenger, an elderly woman, stopped him. "You handled that with such grace," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I hope he learns from this." The CEO smiled warmly. "I hope so too," he replied. "But if nothing else, today was a reminder for all of us to treat each other with kindness, no matter what." As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the CEO knew that the events of that day would leave a lasting impact not just on the pilot, but on everyone who had witnessed it. It was a powerful lesson in humility, accountability, and the importance of standing up for what's right. What happened on that plane was more than just an awkward confrontation. It was a moment of truth that exposed the dangers of prejudice and the importance of respect. The pilot's actions didn't just reflect his personal biases, they represented a failure to uphold the values of the airline. But what made this incident truly powerful was how the CEO chose to respond. Instead of resorting to anger or humiliation, he used the moment to teach a lesson not just to the pilot, but to everyone watching. His calm demeanor, firm accountability, and commitment to improvement showed what true leadership looks like. The pilot's suspension wasn't just a punishment, it was an opportunity for growth and reflection. For the passengers and crew, this was a day they'd never forget. It was a wake-up call about the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their background or appearance. And for the CEO, it was a chance to reaffirm the principles on which his airline was built: respect, inclusion, and excellence. Subscribe to hear more stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change.